between communities, companies, and governments, is there a trust deficit, or does something need to be improved? How are we doing on the information that we're given?
Good question, and a complex one, actually. You know what, I will answer this. Can I just step back? Because what struck me is the term ESG. It is so common. And yet, at least in the Miriu project, we had 17 partner regions across Europe. The only region this ever came up in is Cornwall. Only in the UK is ESG used, not in any of the other countries, which really struck me as to, okay, why? And are we having different conversations in some way? And also, actually, the question of assessments in Europe. What is the relevance of assessments in Europe, and what is the role that they play given the strong governance and given people look to governance? And so, as to your questions about trust, so we had to come up with EU level SLO, social license to operate guidelines, and the one question that came up early on and forever is, how do you standardize something in Europe? It is so heterogeneous. It is so different. But that said, we actually looked at individual values, and then we looked at how that affects attitudes towards governance and how that affects attitudes toward mining. And really, at the end of the day, we still found that in general, Europeans want government to govern. They do not want private companies to govern. And we have two examples, and I'm thinking of third-party assessments here. So both Finland and Spain, in different ways, implemented the Canadian Towards Sustainable Mining program. These are really early days, so in some ways, take this with a grain of salt. But in neither case do we really see this being effective in terms of garnering acceptance on the societal level. In Finland, with the Tel Aviv auto disaster, everyone came together and realized they have to figure a way forward together for the mining industry, how to build trust in the industry and how to rebuild trust in government. And this network approach of all interested stakeholders is really an interesting model, and it worked really well. And they adopted the TSM, and then it went under the Finnish Mining Association. But there was very little outreach to the broader society. So we see a long implementation period of companies, and we see momentum being lost, and people are saying, all right, so you did all of this great work, and it is great work, but what's the outcome of this? How are things getting better? In Spain, they actually adopted the TSM through a national standard. It is early days, but even the companies are having a hard time understanding how it's going to help them. It's expensive, it's cumbersome. A lot of these are junior mining companies without the resources. So I think the role that third-party assessments play in Europe is very different, let me say. I think it's necessary, I think it's essential in many ways, but how you build trust in actually the assessment process itself, I think is the big question, to be honest. Is it needed?
Excellent, which brings me immediately to Rebecca, because she's been trying to build trust by companies into third-party processes. I like the work, how this is smoothly flowing around. Rebecca, question to you then, because you've been doing this with Irma, and I can imagine mining companies going, whoa, we do not want to be audited, and we certainly don't want it to be publicly available until we can, take a look at the results. How has this progressed with Irma trying to convince companies to get it done? Tell us all about your problems with these companies.
Okay, well, I'll touch on a couple of points which you just said, which is in terms of the mining companies themselves. So first of all, yes, the report is actually not published before the mining company has a chance to review it. So that's the first step. When the third-party auditor is finished with the report, that's handed to the company. They actually have, and then they have a chance to review it. And there's actually a 12-month period allowed after they get the results of the audit report, that if they want to go back and actually make changes in the operations and have those particular changes re-audited, they can do so and then release the audit report. So in that way, it actually does take away, I think, some of that, wow, you're asking so much of me, because there is this way to work within the auditing system that makes sense in terms of this level of transparency that we're asking is completely new. And so how do we meet a mining company where they're at to both be transparent and ultimately to drive toward our mission, which is to improve mining? And so if you allow those 12 months for changes to be made, it actually does improve practices at the mine site, which is the ultimate aim of the audit anyway. So that's one way that trust is built. I think that, this question about junior mining companies and the relevance of IRMA, we've actually been really responsive to that. We have an IRMA ready standard that is currently about to come out under consultation. So these are all of the parts of IRMA that a mining company could meet before they actually develop a mine. And so they could actually, for a junior mining company, pass the mine off to a mine developer with this IRMA ready certificate already attached to say, we've done the work that needs to be done in advance. So I think this idea of being really responsive to what the mining companies need is also really important. And then in terms of just building confidence generally, I think that's a broader question here, Masuma, that you're asking. And I just love what Liesl said about a two-way conversation. I think that is so important and it's so true. And we believe that transparency is the first stage of that. And so once you have these audit results that I described that provide so much depth, it actually allows the difficult questions that Liesl said the investors are asking to actually be asked by everyone, right? And so they can ask the difficult questions and that two-way conversation between each stakeholder can happen. The purchaser to the mining company, the community to the mining company. It allows for an authentic dialogue that we just haven't had to date because the information hasn't been publicly available. And then I would just say, I'll just touch on really quickly in terms of how do you build trust with communities, at least for us. It's the level of transparency that is provided. So it's before an audit is noticed, before an audit takes place, it is publicly noticed. We actually do active outreach to communities. And then during the audit, like I talked about, they're interviewed and then they've got the results following the audit as well. And then it's actually also in IRMA's governance structure that goes to how we build trust with not only communities, but all of the other stakeholders, whether it be mining companies or purchasers. And what I mean by that is that IRMA is governed by those 5 stakeholder groups that gathered around the table originally to define the standard for responsible mining. And so to this day, you have those 5 stakeholder groups that govern IRMA equally, meaning that they each not only have an equal vote, but actually a decision cannot go forward in IRMA unless it has the yes from each of the 2 representatives from the stakeholder groups of mining, purchasing, labor, NGOs, and communities. So it's seeing a system where your interests are represented, I think is also really important. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Which brings me to Pierre, because the RMF also has a similar issue in convincing companies because you also ask for documents. And companies need to provide their documents on sustainability, human rights, procurement, which is part of the evidence there. And so, Pierre, I'm curious about 2 things. One is, how do you get companies to trust you? And the second is, you go through commitment and you also go through action. How is that trust built? I mean, you and I, well, okay, probably you more than me, we can read a company document and we can say, okay, this is what this document says. I can see the missing gaps. But when it comes to implementation, it almost sounds like it's a matter of choice or belief. And how do I trust RMF's assessment of action and implementation?
Thanks, Masuma. I think, again, trying to be brief, but I think first, when it comes to trust with companies, relationship with companies, in our case, we do not seek their authorization. They don't pay us. We select them based on scale, geographic criterion. We try to level the playing field, and we assess them. We apply the same indicators, whether the company is publicly listed, privately owned, state-owned, regardless of the commodities extracted. And we only ask public interest information, which ought to be in the public domain. That's our rationale. So you can imagine at first, many companies were skeptical or reluctant to the idea of a fully independent and public assessment. Right? We're not funded by the industry, and we're not a multi-stakeholder initiative where the industry plays a prominent role. And where I think, Rebecca, where making changes and decisions can take such a long time and be sometimes very slow. But years after years, we've seen the relationship with companies evolve. And I think this is exactly this independence and our capacity to articulate society expectations into practical metrics and bring to the forefront the concerns of directly affected stakeholders that gives value to our results and our tools. Also, you won't find many methodologies around that look at economic development, for example, and how or to what extent companies take into account socioeconomic priorities, development plans of producing countries when they make the business and investment decisions. And I think to your point, Pamela, I think this is one of, if not the only way, to rehabilitate the importance and relevance of mining, and perhaps even more in regions like Europe or areas with a long history of anti-mining movements. And this is much, I think, appreciated. This independence, this vast breadth of issues. This is appreciated by a growing number of companies, which often have their shoulder to the wheel and like this kinds of external and independent insights. And because all the evidence is publicly available, it helps build credibility and trust among stakeholders. And this is really not a matter of being, of RMI being better than IRMA or the copper mark or better gold and so on, but really for both investors, shareholders, capital providers, and on-the-ground communities and workers, they want to have informed conversations and collaboration that are not just based on companies' narrative and storytelling, but on facts, raw data, evidence. And having been a mining engineer myself, I mean, I need to say that I know that there are limits to audits, limits to what you can assess, understand, discover within 1, 2, 3 weeks, versus spending 1, 2 years on site. We even have good friends, who are academics. They spend 3 years at one site to just understand the social dynamics and power plays within what we call local communities. But what are those local communities? And with all the respect we have for audit firms and certifications, I think we know they're only part of the answer to the trust deficit and the bad reputation of the mining industry. You can't just transfer this trust deficit to a third party and tell local stakeholders, look, you didn't trust us, but now we got certified, you can trust them. If there's no evidence and transparency integrated in this process, and I think, IRMA is clearly, making the right step forward, but we think even if the audit report is 100-page long, it needs probably more than that. You have human rights due diligence guidelines, assessment templates, survey results. Well, make them public, and then we can have a conversation. And that's what we're trying to push for. So integrating meaningful transparency and collaboration into every aspect of mining instead of piles and piles of ad hoc ESG reporting and tick boxing.
Pierre, I appreciate that you're adding to my reading list by saying these reports should be longer. Well, hey, I don't know. Let's see how long.
It's not much about reporting, but really about transparency,
about
like documenting your actions.
But there is something that you just sort of said. I mean, if you start counting off third-party assessments, whether they're civil society or independent initiatives, I'm also wondering about communities and community fatigue. Because honestly, if I'm walking down the road and the guy with the clipboard comes and says, do you have 5 minutes for a survey? I cross the road. How are you with RMF dealing with community fatigue or community engagement where, I'm sure the community has other things to do as well?
Oh, yes, that's a very good point. And again, we don't have all the answers, of course, and this varies a lot between regions, social backgrounds, context. But we've heard from many communities this frustration and I think disappointment that has been generated by a number of initiatives, projects that only sought to sort of share some ready-made information tools, do a bit of knowledge transfer, a couple of pilots, write the report, and then leave the region afterwards. Community engagement and support, we think, must be a bottom-up approach, like demand-driven, since its inception. You don't simply just come, give a tool, leave. But you need to integrate longer-term capacity building that makes sense to affect people on the ground so that ultimately local communities or mine workers or labor unions are driving the process themselves, that they exercise civic space, they exercise their own agency. And this is a very long process, right? So that requires, besides local translation, local partners, networks, insights, that also requires financial support. and this is, I think, a huge challenge, because some companies which are really willing to enable this level of deep and real collaboration, collaborative decision making, planning, they can also face this issue. You know, how do you cover people's expenses and their income loss because they've not been at work, or they couldn't be at the farm for this day of workshop or a multi-stakeholder forum, given that you have your own anti-bribery policies and you don't want to appear to be co-opting, you know, those local actors. And we think this is why an independent sort of facilitator is important, but again, essential to keep it bottom up and not impose agenda and priorities. And this is where this is how we came up with our mindsight assessment tool, which I mentioned before, a set of very basic sort of plain language engagement questions to trigger the dialogue and discussion. And these were designed by local stakeholder. I think this is key. It's part of the answer, but it's a good part of the answer.